Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I never thought anything like this would happen to me. It's hard to even talk about it, but I've got to get it off my chest. I guess it all started a couple of months ago when my roommate, Sam, started acting weird. We used to be pretty close. Not like best friends or anything, but we'd hang out sometimes, get food together, and study in the common room. Then, out of nowhere, she just stopped talking to me. At first, I thought she was just stressed. Finals were coming up, and I knew she had a lot on her plate. But it got worse. She stopped leaving the room. Her side of the room got messier and messier. Clothes and books were piled everywhere. It was like she didn't care about anything anymore. She wouldn't even respond when I knocked on her door. She just stayed locked in there all day and night. It wasn't just the mess or the silence that got to me. It was the noises. At night, I hear this strange shuffling coming from her room. Like she was moving things around or pacing. Sometimes, I hear whispering. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but it didn't sound like she was on the phone. It was too quiet for that. And it wasn't just once or twice. It was every night. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, but the noises from Sam's room were louder than usual. It wasn't just the shuffling anymore. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and went to her door. "Sam?" I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "Sam, are you okay?" Still nothing. I don't know what made me do it, but I tried the handle. It was locked, of course. But something felt off. I leaned in closer, pressing my ear to the door. That's when I heard it. A voice. But it wasn't Sam's. It was deeper, a man's voice. I froze. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else in there. I was sure of it. I didn't hear anyone come in, and I had been in the room all evening. My heart was racing. I thought about calling out again, but something told me not to. I backed away from the door, trying to stay quiet. I didn't want whoever was in there to know I was listening. I went back to my bed and grabbed my phone. I wanted to text Sam, ask her what was going on, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. I sat there, staring at the screen, waiting for a response that never came. The sounds continued for what felt like hours. The dragging, the whispers, and that man's voice. It was like they were having a conversation, but I couldn't make out any of the words. My mind was racing, thinking of all the worst-case scenarios. Who was in there with her? Why hadn't she said anything to me? Should I call the police? Eventually, the noises stopped. It was like someone flipped a switch. The silence was even worse than the sounds. I just sat there, staring at her door, too afraid to move. I don't know I fell asleep, but when I woke up, the first thing I did was check to see if Sam was still in her room. The door was unlocked. I don't know why, but that scared me even more. I got up and slowly walked over to her door. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand was shaking as I turned the knob. The door creaked open, and I peeked inside. The room was empty. Completely empty. Her bed was neatly made, all her clothes were gone, and the floor was spotless. It didn't make any sense. The room had been a mess just the day before. There were piles of clothes and books everywhere. Now, it looked like no one had ever lived there. My stomach turned. something was seriously wrong. I rushed out of the room and went straight to the dorm's RA. I told her everything, that Sam had been acting strange, that I heard someone in her room, and now she was gone. The RA looked concerned and said she'd check with the housing office, see if Sam had moved out or something. Later that day, the RA came to find me. She said Sam had officially moved out that morning. The thing is, I never saw her leave. I didn't hear her packing up or anything, and I was there all night. I asked the RA if anyone had seen Sam or the guy who was in her room. She looked at me like I was crazy and said, "What guy?" Sam lived alone. I couldn't believe it. I told her again about the voices, the man I heard in the room. She just shrugged and said no one had been signed in to visit Sam, and there were no cameras in the halls, so there was no way to know for sure. But she assured me that Sam had left and I didn't have to worry. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I knew I heard. There was someone else in that room with her. And the way she left, it didn't make sense. I tried calling her a few times, but the calls always went straight to voicemail. Her social media accounts were deactivated too. A couple of weeks passed, and I tried to put it behind me. I moved a new roommate in, and things started to feel normal again. But then, one night, I heard it again. The shuffling, the whispering, that same man's voice. But this time, it wasn't coming from Sam's old room. It was coming from the room next to mine. I don't know what's going on, but something's wrong with this building. Something or someone is still here. And I don't know how much longer I can stay without losing my mind. I rented a beach house for a weekend. I just needed a break from everything. Work had been stressful, life had been stressful, and I figured a quiet weekend by the ocean would be the perfect way to clear my head. The place was small but cozy, right on the edge of the beach, with a deck overlooking the water. It was the kind of place you'd imagine spending a peaceful weekend, sipping coffee in the morning and listening to the waves. When I got there, everything seemed normal at first. The house was clean, and the keys were exactly where the rental agency said they would be, in a small lockbox by the door. I let myself in, unpacked my things, and settled in. It felt nice to be somewhere quiet. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it walking along the beach, reading a book on the deck, and just trying to unwind. It was the second day when things started to feel off. I woke up that morning to the sound of the ocean. I made some coffee and sat on the deck for a while, enjoying the calm. After breakfast, I decided to take a walk down the beach again. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The front door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before I left, but I figured maybe I had just forgotten. I locked it again and didn't think much of it. That night, I cooked dinner and watched a movie on the small TV in the living room. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Like the house felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it. After the movie, I went to bed. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The blanket on the bed was folded differently. I didn't fold it like that when I left in the morning. It wasn't a big change, just a small, neat fold at the foot of the bed, but it was enough to make me pause. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself that maybe I had folded it and just didn't remember. But I knew that wasn't true. I always left the blanket crumpled at the bottom of the bed. Always. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I didn't want to overreact, so I tried to brush it off. Maybe the cleaning crew had come in and tidied up without telling me. I hadn't seen anything about daily housekeeping in the rental description, but it was possible, right? I didn't know. The next day, things got weirder. I went out again in the morning, just for a short walk this time. When I came back, the kitchen felt different. Like someone had been in there. The dish I had left drying by the sink had been moved, and my coffee mug was in a different spot on the counter. I hadn't touched them. I was sure of it. That was when I started to get scared. I checked all the windows and doors to make sure they were locked, and they were. Everything was locked. There was no sign of anyone else being in the house, but I knew things were being moved. I could feel it. Later that afternoon, I decided to call the rental agency. Maybe someone had a key and had been coming in without me knowing. They told me no one had entered the house since I checked in. There was no housekeeping service, and no one else was supposed to have access to the property. I hung up the phone, feeling uneasy. That night, I stayed in. I locked all the doors and windows again, double-checking them this time. I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with another movie, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound in the house seemed louder, more pronounced. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, everything made me jump. I decided to go to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sounds that didn't belong. I must have fallen asleep at some point because when I woke up, it was still dark outside. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 3 a.m. That's when I saw it. On the bedside table, there was a small piece of paper. I hadn't noticed it before. My heart started pounding as I reached for it. The handwriting was neat, almost too neat, and the message was short. I'm watching. My blood ran cold. I sat up in bed, scanning the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the table, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. I dialed 911, but before I could hit call, I heard something from outside the bedroom door. A soft creak. Someone was in the house. I froze. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, clutching my phone, listening to the silence. I couldn't hear anything anymore, but I knew someone had been there. I wasn't imagining it. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally got up the courage to move. I crept out of bed and slowly made my way to the door. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sign of movement on the other side. Nothing. I opened the door, just a crack, and peeked out into the hallway. It was empty. Slowly, I made my way through the house, checking each room, turning on every light as I went. There was no one there. But the front door was unlocked again. I locked it behind me, checking it twice, and sat down on the couch. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care that I had paid for the weekend. I wasn't staying another night. I left the house as quickly as I could and drove straight home. I didn't even tell the rental agency what happened. I just wanted to forget about the whole thing. But I can't. Ever since the weekend, I felt like I'm being watched. Even now, sitting here in my own apartment, I can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me. I keep my doors locked. I check the windows, but it doesn't help. I don't know who was in the house. I don't know how they got in or how long they were there. But I know one thing for sure. They were watching me. And I think they still are. I've always loved jogging, especially in the evenings when the sun is low and the park isn't too crowded. It's my way of clearing my head after a long day. There's this park near my apartment, not far, maybe a 5-minute walk. I jogged there almost every day after work. I'd see the same people most of the time, other joggers, people walking their dogs, the usual. It felt safe. Familiar. I'd never had any reason to feel uneasy. Until a few weeks ago. The first time I noticed him, I didn't think much of it. It was a weekday, sometime around dusk. The park was pretty empty, with just a few people scattered here and there. I had my usual route, starting at the main entrance, cutting across the bridge, circling around the lake, and then looping back. I noticed a man walking along the path as I ran by. He was dressed kind of oddly for someone walking in the park, wearing a hoodie with the hood up even though it wasn't cold, dark jeans. He wasn't doing anything, just walking. But something about him caught my attention. I passed him once, didn't think much of it. But then, a little while later, I saw him again, standing near the entrance where I'd started. It seemed like he'd looped around the park in the opposite direction, somehow crossing paths with me twice. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just taking a stroll like everyone else. The next time I saw him was a few days later. Same spot, near the entrance. He wasn't walking this time. He was standing there, just looking around. I ran past him, and he didn't move. I could feel his eyes following me as I went by. I felt a little uneasy, but I didn't want to overreact. It's a public park, after all. People are allowed to be there. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. A week went by, and I tried to forget about it. I kept jogging, sticking to my usual routine. But then, I saw him again. It was getting dark, and I was nearing the end of my run. The park was almost empty, and I was heading back towards the entrance. That's when I saw him, standing on the path ahead of me, just off to the side. He wasn't moving, just watching me approach. I slowed down, my heart starting to race. As I got closer, I made contact for a split second before looking away. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there. I picked up my pace, not wanting to pass him too slowly. As I ran by, I felt his eyes on me the whole time. My gut told me something was off. But again, I told myself not to overthink it. The next evening, I decided to change my route a little. I figured maybe if I went at a different time or took a different path, I wouldn't see him. So, I went a bit earlier than usual, around late afternoon, and ran in the opposite direction, starting at the lake this time. It was going fine for a while. I felt more relaxed, like maybe I was just being paranoid the other times. But then, as I was nearing the end of my loop, I saw him again. This time, he was further down the path, but he was walking in the same direction as me. I was gaining on him. I slowed down, not wanting to pass him, but as soon as I did, he stopped walking and stood to the side, just like before, watching me. I felt my stomach drop. He changed his direction again. I didn't know if he was following me or just had some weird pattern, but it didn't feel right. That's when I decided I wasn't going to jog at night anymore. It wasn't worth the uneasy feeling. I figured I'd just stick to early morning runs or maybe take a break from the park for a while. But a few days later, I found myself back in the park. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was telling myself I was being ridiculous, that nothing was wrong. I decided to stick to a well-lit path and not go too far from the entrance. It was around sunset, and the park was still busy enough that I didn't feel too uneasy. I didn't see him at first, and I started to think maybe he wasn't even there that night. Maybe I'd made the whole thing up in my head. I was about halfway through my run, heading down the main path, when I caught sight of him again. This time, he was ahead of me, on a small trail that branched off into a more secluded area of the park. I slowed down. Something about the way he was standing there, just off the main path, made my skin crawl. He was waiting. I was sure of it. I kept my pace steady, pretending like I hadn't noticed him. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was avoiding him, but I wasn't about to take that trail. As I got closer, he moved. He stepped onto the main path and started walking towards me. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I glanced around, hoping to see someone else nearby, but the park was mostly empty now. I thought about turning back, but it felt too obvious. I kept going, trying to stay calm. As we got closer, he suddenly cut across the path, moving towards me in a way that wasn't casual. It was deliberate. He was trying to intercept me. I stopped, my mind racing. I could turn around and run, but I wasn't sure if I could outrun him. He was closer to the exit than I was. He knew the park better than I did. I could tell that now. I started walking again, faster this time, but he matched my pace. I could see him out of the corner of my eye, trying to close the distance between us. I knew I couldn't make it back to the entrance before he caught up to me. There was a small clearing up the path that led to another trail, one that looped around towards the road. I didn't know the trail that well, but I figured it was my best shot. I veered off the path, heading towards it. As soon as I did, I heard him speed up behind me. He was following me. There was no doubt in my mind now. I broke into a sprint. My legs were burning, my breath coming in sharp gasps, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I could hear his footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. He was gaining on me. The trail twisted through the trees, the branches scraping my arms as I pushed through. My mind was racing, trying to think of what to do. I didn't have my phone with me. No one knew I was out here. Just when I thought I couldn't run any farther, I saw the road up ahead, just beyond the trees. I could hear the distant sound of cars. If I could just make it there, I'd be safe. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I was so close. I could see the break in the trees where the trail opened up to the road. And then I heard him stop. The footsteps behind me stopped. I didn't slow down. I kept running until I burst through the trees and onto the side of the road. A car drove by, and I waved my arms, trying to get their attention, but they didn't stop. I turned around, expecting to see him there, but the trail was empty. He was gone. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. I waited, watching the trail, but he never came out. Eventually, I made my way home. I didn't go back to the park after that. I couldn't. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know he was following me. And I know that if I hadn't run when I did, I might not have made it out of there. I got off work later than usual that night. It must have been around 11:30 when I finally pulled into my neighborhood. The streets were empty, just the usual quiet that comes with living in a small town. I was tired, and all I could think about was getting home, having a quick bite, and crashing into bed. But when I turned the corner onto my street, I saw it right away. There was a truck parked in my driveway. An old, beat-up truck that I didn't recognize. It wasn't from around here, that much was obvious. My neighbors all had newer cars, and I knew most of them pretty well. This thing looked like it hadn't been washed in years, the paint chipped and rusted in places. It didn't make any sense. I slowed down and pulled up behind it, just sitting there for a minute with my headlights shining on the back of the truck. I was trying to make sense of why it would be there. Maybe someone got the wrong house? But it was late, and I hadn't heard from anyone saying they were coming by. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, leaving the headlights on to light up the driveway. My house was dark, no lights on inside, which made sense because I lived alone. But the truck being there, it set off alarm bells. I felt uneasy, like something wasn't right. I walked up to the driver's side of the truck and looked in through the window. The interior was just as trashed as the outside. Empty bottles on the floor, fast food wrappers crumpled up on the seat. There were no keys in the ignition, and it didn't look like anyone was inside. That's when I heard movement coming from the woods behind my house. My property backs up to a small patch of forest, nothing too big, but enough trees to make it dark and thick once you get a few feet in. I turned towards the sound, my heart starting to race, and that's when I saw them. 3 figures stepped out of the tree line, moving slowly, like they didn't care that I saw them. They were spread out, each coming from a different part of the woods, but all heading in my direction. The truck must have been theirs. I felt a chill run down my spine as they got closer. They weren't saying anything, just walking towards me, like they had all the time in the world. I couldn't make out their faces clearly because they were still in the shadow, but I could see enough to know they weren't just lost hikers or neighbors coming over to say hi. Something about the way they moved, slow but deliberate, made it clear this wasn't an accident. I backed up towards my car, my eyes darting between the 3 of them. My brain was trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out what to do. I wasn't sure if I should get back in my car and drive off or stand my ground. But my body was telling me to move, to get away. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "What are you doing here?" "This is my property." None of them answered. They just kept walking, slow and steady. One of them was wearing a hooded jacket, his hands stuffed into his pockets. Another had on a cap, his face hidden in the dark. The third one was bigger, taller than the others, with a stockier build. I couldn't make out any details, just the outlines of their figures as they came closer. I was about 10 feet from my car when one of them finally spoke. "We're just here for the truck," the man with the hood said. His voice was low, calm, like this was all normal. Like they had every right to be standing there in my driveway, blocking me in. "Well, you need to move it," I said, my voice shaking a little despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "I don't know what you're doing, but you can't stay here." The man in the hood smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was more like he was amused by what I said, like he was humoring me. "We'll move it. Just give us a minute." They were closer now, too close for comfort. I could see their faces bare, and there was something off about the way they were looking at me. Like they were sizing me up, deciding what to do next. The air felt thick, like everything had slowed down around me. Without thinking, I reached for my phone in my pocket, my fingers fumbling to unlock it. I didn't even know who I was going to call 911, a neighbor, anyone. But before I could hit the screen, a big guy stepped forward, quicker than the others, and I froze. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat. "You should put that away," he said, his voice deep and flat. "We're not looking for trouble." I didn't move for a second, my thumb hovering over the phone. Everything in me wanted to run, to get in my car and lock the doors, but I couldn't. I didn't know what these guys were capable of, and I was outnumbered. I had to play it smart, or at least try to. Slowly, I lowered the phone, slipping it back into my pocket. The big guy nodded like I'd made the right choice. I didn't feel any safer. "We're just gonna grab the truck and go," the guy with the hood said again, his voice calm, like he was in control of the whole situation. The problem was, they weren't moving towards the truck. They were still standing there, too close to me, watching, waiting for something. It felt like they were trying to see how far they could push me, how scared they could make me before I snapped. I took a step back, my back hitting the side of my car, and I glanced at the door handle. If I could get inside fast enough, I might be able to lock myself in and call for help. But I knew they'd see me move, and I didn't know how they'd react. The hooded man must have seen the look in my eyes, because he stepped closer, just a couple feet away now. "Don't do anything stupid," he said quietly, and that smile was back. The same one that didn't reach his eyes. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. The tall guy suddenly turned towards the truck, breaking the tension. He walked over to the driver's side door and opened it. He didn't look at me as he climbed in, but I noticed the other two were still standing there, watching me. I didn't move until I heard the engine start. The truck rumbled to life, and the headlights came on, bathing the driveway in bright light. The tall guy revved the engine a couple times, but the other two didn't move. They were still watching me. Finally, after what felt like forever, the man with the hood nodded. "We're leaving now," he said, almost like it was a favor. "But you should be more careful." I didn't respond. I couldn't even breathe right until they finally started moving towards the truck. The big guy in the driver's seat pulled the truck out of the driveway, and the other two climbed into the back. They didn't say anything else, just sat there, staring at me as the truck backed out and rolled slowly down the street. I stood there, frozen in place, until they disappeared around the corner. Even then, I couldn't move for a minute, my mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. Once I was sure they were gone, I scrambled into my car and locked the doors, my hand shaking as I grabbed my phone. I called the cops right away, my voice barely steady enough to explain what had just happened. They didn't find anything. The truck was gone by the time they got there, and there were no signs of anyone in the woods. No footprints, no nothing. It was like they'd never been there at all. I don't know who those guys were or what they wanted, but I haven't felt safe at home since. Every time I pull into my driveway now, I can't help but look around, half expecting to see that truck parked there again, those men stepping out of the woods. I've thought about moving, but I haven't yet. I just keep hoping it was a one-time thing, that they won't come back. But I don't know for sure. I had been feeling off for a while, like the stress of everything was building up too much. Work was getting harder to deal with, and I just needed to get away, clear my head. So, I rented this cabin, way out in the woods, for a long weekend. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, single-story cabin, a little rundown, but it looked cozy in the pictures. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just trees and quiet. That was the whole point. When I got there, it was already late in the afternoon. The drive took longer than I thought, winding roads that turned into dirt paths that deeper and went into the forest. The cabin looked the way I expected from the outside, weathered wood, a sagging porch, but it had a certain charm. There were a few other cabins scattered through the trees, but they were pretty far off, and I didn't see anyone around. Perfect, I thought. Just me, the quiet, and my thoughts. The inside of the cabin was simple. A small living room with an old couch and a wood stove, a tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, and a bedroom with a queen-sized bed. It wasn't exactly luxury, but it was clean enough, and I unpacked my things, setting my bag down by the bed. I didn't need much for the weekend, just a couple of books, some food I'd brought along, and my journal. I made a fire in the stove, opened a beer, and settled in for the night. The first evening was fine. Peaceful, actually. I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, listening to the wind rustling through the trees and the distant sound of the creek running behind the cabin. It felt good to be alone, to not have to think about work or people or anything. Just me and the quiet. When it got dark, I went inside, locked the door, and headed to bed. That's when I first noticed something that seemed a little off. There was this smell, faint but noticeable, like something damp and musty. I thought maybe it was the old wood or the cabin just being closed up for a while. I didn't think much of it, though. I opened a window to let some air in and figured it would go away. I woke up in the middle of the night. I'm not sure what woke me, but something felt wrong. I could hear this faint creaking sound, like the floorboards were shifting under someone's weight. I laid there for a minute, trying to tell myself it was just the old cabin settling, that old buildings made noises like that. But it kept going, slow and steady, like someone was walking around. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The wind had picked up outside, the trees making soft, shuffling sounds, but underneath it, I could hear it again. The creaking wasn't coming from inside the cabin, it was coming from the porch. My heart started racing. I grabbed my phone, but of course, no service. I checked the time, it was just after 2 a.m. I told myself it was probably just an animal. Deer, or maybe a raccoon. I wasn't used to the sounds of the forest, so it was easy to let my mind jump to conclusions. But then I heard the sound again, louder this time, like someone putting their weight on the porch steps. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, moving towards the front door. The fire in the wood stove had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room. I didn't turn on any lights, I didn't want to make any noise. I stood there for a second, listening, and that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, right outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen for what felt like forever, waiting for something else to happen. Part of me expected the door to burst open, someone to come crashing in, but nothing happened. The footsteps just stopped. I crept over to the window beside the door, careful not to make any noise, and peeped through the crack in the curtains. It was too dark to see anything clearly, just the outline of the trees and the faint light from the moon. No one was there, at least not that I could see. But I knew what I'd heard. Someone had been out there, I was sure of it. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I laid there, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound, any sign that whoever or whatever it was had come back. The rest of the night passed in silence. The next morning, I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably just my nerves, being out there alone for the first time. I made coffee, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest, but when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the porch, there were muddy footprints. Not animal prints, human. They weren't large, probably about my size, but they were unmistakably shoe prints, and they were fresh, still damp from the morning dew. Whoever had been out there last night had walked right up to the door. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I looked around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but everything was still. The footprints led from the steps and disappeared into the dirt path that led back into the woods. I couldn't tell where they went from there. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but I didn't want to give in to my fear. This was supposed to be my weekend to clear my head, to get away from everything. I convinced myself that maybe it was a hiker, or someone who got lost in the woods and found the cabin by accident. They probably didn't mean any harm. But still, the thought nagged at me. Why would someone come up to the door in the middle of the night and not knock? Why didn't they say anything? I spent the day trying to shake it off, but I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. But there was no one. Just the trees swaying gently in the wind. That night, I locked the door and put a chair up against it. I wasn't going to take any chances. I made sure all the windows were locked, too, and I kept the fire going in the stove, hoping it would help me sleep. but I couldn't relax. Every creak, every gust of wind had me on edge. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a sound. A soft thud, like something bumping against the door. I sat up, my heart racing, listening. It happened again, another thud, this time louder. It sounded like someone was trying to push the door open, testing it. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left by the bed and crept towards the door, my hands shaking. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, as I approached the door. The chair I'd wedged under the doorknob was still in place, but the door itself was rattling, like someone was trying to force it open. I stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any weapons, nothing to defend myself with. I thought about yelling, trying to scare them off, but my throat felt tight, like I couldn't get the words out. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Whoever it was had gone quiet. I didn't move for what felt like hours, just standing there in the dark, clutching the flashlight. Eventually, I crept back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I just laid there, wide awake, waiting for something else to happen. The next morning, I found more footprints. This time, they circled the cabin, like whoever it was had been walking around, looking for a way in. I didn't waste any time. I packed my things, threw them in the car, and got the hell out of there. I don't know who it was, or what they wanted, but I'm not going back. That cabin might have seemed like the perfect escape, but now I can't shake the feeling that someone had been living there, waiting for someone like me to show up. And I was lucky to get out when I did. It was supposed to be just a quick trip to the mall. My daughter, Emma, needed some new shoes for school, and I figured we could grab lunch afterward. She was excited about getting a new pair of sneakers, the ones with the lights that blink when she walks. She wouldn't stop talking about them the whole way there, and I was glad for the chance to spend some time with her. Work had been crazy lately, and I felt like I'd been missing out on these small moments. We got to the mall around noon, and it was busy, but not too crowded. Families, teenagers, the usual Saturday crowd. Emma's small hand was wrapped around mine as we walked through the entrance. She was bouncing along, full of energy. I led her toward the shoe store, and she immediately ran over to the kids section, her eyes scanning the shelves for the shoes she'd been talking about. I smiled, watching her, trying to soak in the moment. I let go of her hand for just a second to grab my phone from my pocket. I had a text from work, something about a deadline, but it wasn't anything urgent. I sent a quick reply and shoved the phone back in my pocket. When I looked up, Emma wasn't in front of me anymore. It didn't hit me right away. I thought she had just moved to another aisle, still looking at shoes. But when I walked over to where I thought she'd be, she wasn't there. I called her name. Emma? No answer. I walked around the section, scanning the aisles, thinking maybe she'd wandered over to the clothes or the toys. Nothing. My heart started to race. I told myself not to panic. She was probably just nearby, maybe got distracted by something in the mall. I walked faster, calling her name a little louder now. Emma. Emma, where are you? I circled the store, my eyes darting between people, looking for her little blonde ponytail and pink jacket. But she wasn't there. I stepped out into the main corridor of the mall, my head whipping around, scanning the sea of faces. Emma. I shouted this time, but no one even looked my way. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and my stomach twisted in knots. Where was she? I rushed to the nearest security desk, my voice shaking as I told the guard I couldn't find my daughter. He nodded, his face calm, like this was something he dealt with all the time. He picked up a walkie-talkie and started talking into it, describing Emma. "We'll find her," he said, his voice steady, but it didn't do much to calm me down. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. I couldn't just stand there waiting. I started walking again, faster this time, almost running through the mall, shouting her name. I tried to think, where would she have gone? She knew better than to wander off. I had drilled it into her head 100 times. Stay close. Don't talk to strangers. But she was only 6, and kids don't always listen. I was just about to call the police when my phone buzzed. I yanked it out of my pocket, expecting a work message, but it wasn't. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaking. A man's voice answered. "Is this Emma's dad?" I froze. Yes, I am. Do you have her? Is she okay?" "She's fine," the man said, his tone calm, too calm. I found her wandering near the food court. She looked lost, so I figured I'd call the number on her ID bracelet. Relief flooded through me for a second. Emma always wore a bracelet with my number on it in case we got separated. "Thank God," I breathed out. "Where are you?" "I'll come get her right now." "I'm just outside," he said. "Out by the west entrance. The one near the parking garage." That didn't sound right. The west entrance was on the opposite side of the mall from where we'd been. But maybe she had wandered farther than I thought. It wasn't impossible. I started walking, still holding the phone to my ear. "Okay, I'm on my way." "She's safe," the man said again, and something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. "But you'll want to hurry." I started moving faster, weaving through the crowd. My mind was racing, but something wasn't sitting right with me. His voice, there was something off about it. Too calm, too controlled. And why hadn't he just taken her to security? Why the west entrance? "Can I talk to her?" I asked, slowing my pace a bit. There was a pause. Just a second, but it was long enough to make my heart lurch. "She's with me," he said, dodging the question. "Like I said, just hurry." I stopped walking. My hand tightened around the phone. "I want to talk to my daughter," I said, my voice sharper this time. "Put her on the phone." Another pause. Then the man's voice came back, a little colder now. "Just come to the west entrance." That's when it hit me. Something was very, very wrong. My stomach dropped, and my legs felt weak. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct in my body was screaming that this wasn't right. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice shaking. "If you have my daughter, you'll stay where you are until they get there." The line went dead. I stood there, frozen in place, my hand still gripping the phone, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. That voice. I knew in my gut he didn't have her. At least, not in the way he wanted me to think. I ran back to the security desk, out of breath, trying to explain what had just happened. The guard's face changed when I told him about the call. He picked up the phone immediately, calling for backup, his voice urgent now. Minutes passed like hours. I felt sick, dizzy, imagining all the terrible things that could be happening. The police arrived, and I gave them the number that had called me, described the man's voice, everything I could remember. They told me they'd trace it, but I could see it in their faces. They knew it wouldn't lead anywhere good. Then, just as I thought I was going to collapse from fear, one of the guards came rushing toward me. "We found her," he said, and for a moment, I couldn't even process the words. "She's at the shoe store," he said. "One of the employees found her hiding in the back, near the stockroom." I ran, not caring how fast I was moving or who I bumped into. I sprinted through the mall until I got to the store, my heart pounding in my ears. And there she was, sitting on a bench, holding a stuffed animal the store clerk had given her, tears streaming down her face. I grabbed her, pulling her into my arms, holding her so tight I could barely breathe. "Daddy," she sobbed, burying her face in my chest. "I was looking for you, and I got scared." "I'm here," I whispered, holding her close, my hand shaking. "I'm here, baby." The police never found the man. The number he called from was a burner phone, untraceable. They checked the security footage, but the west entrance cameras were down that day. It was like he planned it, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. But I'll never forget that voice on the phone, the way he sounded so calm, so sure. And I'll never stop wondering what would have happened if I'd gone to the west entrance that day. If I hadn't listened to my gut. All I know is that I almost lost my little girl, and I'll never be able to shake the feeling that she was just a few steps away from something terrible. I hadn't seen Mrs. Brenner in days, which was odd. She was the kind of neighbor you couldn't miss, always outside tending to her flowers, waving to people as they walked by. I'd moved into the house next to hers about 5 years ago, and since then, I'd gotten used to seeing her almost every day. Even when the weather was bad, she'd be out there, in her thick jacket and gloves, pulling weeds or chatting with whoever passed by. At first, I thought maybe she had gone to visit her sister. She'd mentioned her sister a few times, said she lived in another state and they didn't see each other much, so sometimes she'd take a trip to stay for a week or so. That made sense, but something about it still nagged at me. Mrs. Brenner was in her late 70s, and she always told me when she was going away, asking me to keep an eye on her house while she was gone. But this time, there was no knock on my door, no casual conversation over the fence. By the 4th day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her car was still parked in the driveway, which made the whole visiting her sister thing impossible. I tried telling myself I was just overthinking it. Maybe she was sick and didn't want to worry anyone. Maybe she lost track of time. I even considered calling her, but I realized I didn't have her phone number. Despite our frequent conversations, we'd never exchanged that. So, that afternoon, I decided to walk over to her house and check in. I figured, at worst, I'd knock and she'd answer, and I'd feel ridiculous for worrying so much. Her house looked normal enough, but it felt different. It was too quiet. No wind chimes clinking in the breeze, no sound of the TV faintly playing through the windows. I walked up to the front door and knocked, my knuckles rapping against the wood louder than I'd intended. There was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, listening carefully for any sounds inside, footsteps, the creak of a floorboard, anything. But the house stayed silent. I stepped back, glancing around the neighborhood, wondering if anyone else had noticed her absence. There were no other neighbors around, and I hadn't seen anyone mention it in passing. I took a deep breath and tried the door handle, telling myself I'd just jiggle it, see if it was locked, then leave. But when I turned the knob, the door swung open. I stood there for a second, frozen. It wasn't like Mrs. Brenner to leave her door unlocked. She was careful, always mentioning how she kept the windows latched and the doors double-locked. The uneasy feeling I had all week came rushing back, stronger now. "Mrs. Brenner?" I called out, my voice shaky as I stepped inside. The house smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in days. I hesitated in the entryway, looking around. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. Her shoes were neatly lined up by the door. Her purse was hanging on the hook by the closet. But something still felt wrong. I walked further into the house, into the living room. The curtains were drawn, casting long shadows across the room, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. Mrs. Brenner's favorite armchair sat empty, a throw blanket neatly folded over the back. The TV remote was on the side table, exactly where she always left it. Mrs. Brenner? I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. I started to feel stupid. Maybe she was just upstairs, sleeping or resting. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away, so I made my way toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom step. That's when I saw a dark smudge on the wall near the base of the stairs. It looked like a handprint. A smeared, dirty handprint. My stomach dropped. I walked closer, reaching out to touch it, but stopped myself. I leaned in, squinting at the mark, and I knew it wasn't dirt. It was blood. My heart started pounding in my chest, and suddenly the silence in the house felt suffocating. I backed away from the stairs, my mind racing. Maybe she'd fallen, hurt herself, and couldn't get to the phone. Maybe she was upstairs, injured, needing help. I bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, calling her name over and over. Mrs. Brenner. Mrs. Brenner. I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty house. I reached the top and turned down the hallway toward her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. The bed was made, the pillows fluffed, everything perfectly in place. But there, just inside the door, was another smudge, more blood, this time on the edge of the doorframe. I felt sick. Something had happened to her. I was sure of it now. I turned, checking the bathroom, the guest room, but they were all empty, just as neat and tidy as her bedroom. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange. The closet door at the end of the hall, it was cracked open just an inch or two, like someone had hurriedly shut it but hadn't pulled it closed all the way. I swallowed hard, taking a step toward it. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and my hands felt clammy as I reached for the knob. I told myself it was probably nothing, just my imagination running wild. But as I gripped the doorknob, a cold dread settled over me. I yanked the door open, and inside, huddled on the floor in a corner, was Mrs. Brenner. She was alive, barely. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her hands were shaking, and her clothes were stained with blood. She looked up at me, her lips quivering, but no words came out. "Oh my God," I whispered, dropping to my knees beside her. "Mrs. Brenner, what happened? Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring at me, her eyes darting to the door behind me, like she was afraid someone would come in at any moment. I reached for my phone, fumbling to dial 911, but before I could press the call button, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "He's still here." My blood ran cold. I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Who? Who's still here? She shook her head, her grip tightening on my wrist. "He said he'd come back. He said if I tried to leave, he'd come back in." Her voice broke, and she started to sob, her whole body shaking. I didn't know what to do. I needed to get her out of there, but the thought of someone else being in the house made my skin crawl. I stood up, my legs trembling, and glanced toward the stairs. "Mrs. Brenner, we need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though I was anything but. "I'll get you out of here. We'll go to my house, and I'll call the police from there." She didn't move, didn't respond, just sat there, her eyes wide and fixed on the hallway like she was expecting someone to walk through the door any second. I crouched down again, trying to coax her up. "Come on, we have to go," I said, practically begging her to move. That's when I heard it. The front door creaked open downstairs. My heart stopped. I froze, my eyes meeting Mrs. Brenner's. She let out a small whimper, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the house. I couldn't breathe. I glanced around the room, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. There was no time. I grabbed Mrs. Brenner's arm, pulling her up as gently as I could, guiding her out of the closet. She was trembling, barely able to stand. The footsteps grew louder, closer. We moved down the hallway as quietly as we could, my heart pounding in my chest so hard I thought it might give us away. I led her into the guest room, where there was a small window that faced my house. It was our only way out. I helped her climb up onto the windowsill, praying the person downstairs wouldn't hear us. She winced as she hoisted herself through the window, and I followed right behind her, sliding out just as the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. We dropped down onto the grass, and I half carried, half dragged her across the yard, my eyes darting toward the house the whole time. I expected to see someone come charging out after us at any second, but no one did. Once we were in my house, I locked every door and called the police. They came, swarming Mrs. Brenner's house, but whoever had been there was long gone. They found blood, just like I had, but no sign of a man Mrs. Brenner had described. She never spoke about it again. Not to me, not to the police. They searched for him, but he was never caught. And Mrs. Brenner? She sold her house and moved away within a month.